Hey guys, this is National Master Kevin Yang back at it with another video. So here we have a game against Runinja. And Runinja, always a fierce fighter. So interestingly enough, I played the move b6 in response to d4, and after knight c3, bishop to b7, and we transpose to something that we've seen a lot. The Owens defense. You remember the b6, the bishop b7? I love to play the Owens defense. Knight f3, bishop to b4, and after bishop d3, I continue putting pressure. If e5 ever happens, I just play knight to e4, right? Put some pressure on that knight. Bishop can take, but I'll take back. And if bishop to d2 is played, I'll just take and I'll play d5 because I want to keep this knight, right? I want to keep it strong. If you take on e4, I just take and the pawn becomes very powerful, right? And if en passant, right, then I just take back with a knight or I take back with a pawn. Both moves work. But in the game, our friend played queen to e2, and after d5, e5, knight to e4. So I'm following the same principles. I want to put pressure. Bishop d2. I play take, and c5. So same idea, right? Castles, knight takes d2. And in this position, you might be like, well, why didn't you just castle? And the answer is I was a little bit afraid of if our friend Runinja moved the bishop, moved the knight, and got to play f3. I was a little bit afraid of how that would play out. And I played knight takes d2 out of fear because I thought if white one day gets to play f3, I'm not liking my position anymore. So I took on d2, bishop to b5 check. This was interesting. I was not expecting this at all. And I guess Runinja just wanted to trade something. I wasn't sure. But I was thinking, okay, if queen takes d2, then I could play castles, I could play bishop to a6, trading. But after bishop to b5, I trade, and I accept the trade, I castle. And here was a defining moment. I remember in this position I said, okay, well, white wants to play f4 for obvious reasons. And I wondered whether I was supposed to expand with rook to c8, pawn takes, knight to a5, and knight to c4, or whether I was supposed to just try to open up the f file somehow. And in my mind, I thought that, okay, well, I do help our friend undouble the pawns here, but how do I really take advantage of that pawn on c3 once it gets on c3? I can double up, I can go attack it all I want, but I don't know. I personally felt that playing f6 made me more impactful. f4 happened, and now I take, and I took on f1. King takes, and this was the moment where, okay, well, I still have the option of trying to go queen c7 and setting something down the c file, or I can go with queen h4 and rook f8. Right? Queen h4 threatening this pawn and this pawn. So I did that, but after knight f3, rook f8, right? It looks like my queen is hanging, but the king is pinned. So king g1, and now queen g4, h3. I bring my queen closer, and now knight g5. And this was the moment where I saw a breakthrough after c takes d4, but I also didn't. So here's what I saw. I saw that after pawn takes, knight takes d4. I saw this and I was like, perfect. If Runinja falls into it, wonderful. Now, what I was calculating is the move knight takes e6. Threatens our rook and threatens our pawn. So what do we do now, right? Pawn takes c3, queen takes d5. And all of a sudden, there's a pretty bad attack on our king, right? And some attacks on our other pieces. So I said, okay, I can't let our friend Runinja do that. What if I play instead knight takes e5, saying, if you take on f8, I'm going to take on, not take, I'm going to check on f3. With my queen pinning your pawn, I get your queen because I do. So this was what I was calculating, and I said, okay, knight takes d4, protects the f3 square. So then what do I do next, right? Rook f4. And the idea is, well, we get our rook to e4 maybe. Try to get some sort of domination on the square that we want. And you might be like, well, what happens if knight to e2, right? And there are many things after knight to e2. I can play knight to f3, as usual, right? So there's a lot of pressure here. But what if king h1, right? Then there's rook to f2 and saying, well, I'm cutting off your defense and I'm threatening checkmate. So that's why in this position, it has to be maybe rook to f1. After rook takes f1, king takes f1, knight to c4. Like the knight might be coming to e3, but after queen to e2, I'm pretty sure knight to e3, king to g1, there really isn't that much for me to work with here. So I was like, well, if we enter this variation, let's go into it. But in the game, knight takes d4 was played after c takes d4, queen takes, and I was pretty relaxed here. Mainly because I got a pawn, and secondly because it's not very easy to get a pawn against Runinja. Rook f1, I said, okay, well, you give me another pawn, and I'll take another pawn. So now I'm up 3 pawns. So you're like, well, National Master Kevin Yang, you pulled a hat trick, right? You got 3 pawns in like 5 moves. And I'm like, yeah, well, that's because our friend Runinja made some mistakes that gave me some pawns. Queen g4, saying, okay, I'm going to threaten this pawn, I'm going to check, then I'm going to bring the queen back, and I'm going to play a5. So this pawn is defended, no checks, and after h4, I play h6, saying, oh, well, I'll give the king a little bit of breathing room, just in case. Queen a4, queen f7, queen b5, eyeing the b6 pawn, but also eyeing if my queen ever moves, maybe the e8 square, just in case if white can ever take the e6 pawn, that would be something. But after queen g6, king h2, I played queen f5, I snatched the pawn on e5, I played a4, and here I was thinking, well, all I need to do is number 1, promote some pawns, and number 2, don't fall into a sort of queen e4, queen a8 perpetual, right? So after g3, I played a3 because I thought, okay, well, the queen has no line to my king. Queen to a6, queen to e3. Simple as that. I'm guarding both pawns. Queen to a4, e5, saying, if you come and check me, I'm just going to close down this entire diagonal, right? Queen d1, and now a2. And at this moment, I remember calculating a little bit, because after queen takes d5, it looks like white might have a chance at a perpetual, but there's no chance. Queen f5, g6, queen f7, and the sneaky queen to g7. So after a2, queen f1, I played queen f3, just to avoid queen f5 again. Queen f3, queen a1, and at this moment I felt like queen f2 had to be played because I was protecting this and potentially promoting the e-pawn, king g4, d4. I could have also played h5 if I wanted to, because after h5, king takes h5 leads to queen to f5 checkmate, and king to g5 leads to queen f6, right? Just trading the queens with a check and winning the game. Or I could play queen to f3, right? Going to g4 and saying, well, maybe that's checkmate. So after king to g4, I instead played d4. Wanted to make things easier for me. Just continue pushing. So after king h3, queen f5, I played queen to d5. Now it's even easier to push these guys. The queen is like the rook. It's like giving back end support. King h3, I'll push. Queen to e5, saying, now I control the a1 square. Queen a1, queen d1, I queen, and what I do is I box the king in. My next moves are queening and queen h1. So this was a tough game, but let's look at what happened here. So the opening was okay for both players. Knight takes d2 was a first critical moment, and after we traded here, this was a critical moment. Do I go with the rook c8 and pile up on the c5 plan, or do I go with f6, try to break the center, and try to disrupt something with e5, right? So I played f6, and things are okay. Rook f8, queen to g4, and this was another moment. White had to play knight takes e6 in order to say, well, if you take on e5 and threaten f3, I'm just going to take on d4 to protect the f3 square. But in the game, knight takes happened, queen takes g5, and with another trade of rooks at this moment, this was another big mistake, right? Rook takes, queen to c1, I get some pawns, I get to safely promote, I get to move my queen to safe locations. I was pretty safe when it came to directing how the pawns were promoted, and it was a tough game for sure. But I'd like to tell you, Runinja, keep on fighting, and you'll do very well. So, thank you, and I'll see you next time.